Hey everybody, Dr. G here. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist as well as a body language expert, and today we're going to be analyzing the behavior and body language of the U.S. vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. A couple of quick things before we get started. One, I wanted to make sure you know that the goal of this video is to be politically neutral. I have no interest in influencing who you plan to vote for. In addition to that, I do want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. All right, let's go.
Is an absolute fundamental necessity for the United States to have the steady leadership there. You saw it experienced today, where along with our Israeli partners and our coalition, able to stop the incoming attack. But what's fundamental here is that steady leadership is going to matter. It's clear, and the world saw.
So what I want you to be paying attention to is I want you to watch Vance's reactions. He's very different than Trump and Harris were. He tends to be somebody who looks at his opponent, tries not to show overt reactions. Oftentimes, people feel a need to react in the moment, shake their head vigorously, knowing they disagree with something, say something out loud. That's not his strategy, but that doesn't mean he's not leaking certain emotions. Let's keep watching.
But it's not just that. It's those that were closest to Donald Trump that understand how dangerous he is when the world is this dangerous. His chief of staff, John Kelly, said that he was the most flawed human being he'd ever met.
So right there, we saw a little bit of an involuntary reaction. There were a few things we observed. Let's go back for a second. I'll explain exactly what we saw.
But it's not just that. It's those that were closest to Donald Trump that understand how.
So as you can see, when Walz is talking about those closest to Donald Trump, you see Vance starting to move around a little bit. That probably means there's more emotion coming up around this.
Closest to Donald Trump that understand how dangerous he is when the world is this.
And for a brief second, you can see him jerk his elbow. It's almost like he's emotionally reacting to some sort of dialogue in his head or maybe a response he has, but he's trying to keep it subdued. So it's very interesting to see these very subtle reactions from him because he's trying not to show how he feels. Watch this part one last time.
It's those that were closest to Donald Trump that understand how dangerous he is when the world is this dangerous.
See, when he said how dangerous he is, it's almost like he wanted to disagree, almost wanted to say something, but also didn't want to interrupt, was trying to keep it sort of under wraps. So it's interesting to see how controlled Vance is trying to be during this.
His chief of staff, John Kelly, said that he was the most flawed human being he'd ever met.
As you can see very briefly, Vance is bunching his lips. So when he's talking about what Kelly said, he's feeling stress, he's feeling frustration.
His chief of staff, John Kelly, said that he was the most flawed human being he'd ever met. And both of his secretaries of defense and his national security advisors said he should be nowhere near the White House. Now, the person closest to them, Donald Trump, said he's unfit for the highest office. That was Senator Vance. What we've seen out of Vice President Harris is we've seen.
Now, he did a good job of having a very little reaction. He did swallow hard when he said that, which probably means his mouth is drying out. He's probably feeling stress, probably feeling irritation as he's hearing this, but he's doing a really good job of keeping a poker face. Just watch his throat right after he says this.
That was Senator Vance. What we've seen out of Vice President Harris is we've seen steady leadership.
Donald Trump actually delivered stability in the world, and he did it by establishing effective.
I want you to be watching Tim Walz for a minute. So similar to what we just did with Vance, I want you to be paying attention to Walz's reaction as Vance is speaking.
Deterrence. People were afraid of stepping out of line. Iran, which launched this attack, has received over $100 billion in unfrozen assets thanks to the Kamala Harris.
So you're going to notice Walz taking notes at times. Now, I get that sometimes they do this because they need to remember what to say, but it also is a good way to help manage anxiety or stress. I would say of the two of them right now, Vance actually appears to be more confident than Walz does. Walz does more that probably helps manage anxiety or manage stress than you see Vance doing. Oftentimes, Vance will do it with subtle facial expressions. Walz does it more directly or by looking away, things like that. Let's keep going.
Administration. What do they use that money for? They use it to buy weapons that they're now launching against.
Okay. Once again, I hate to pause again so soon, but there was a subtle reaction from Walz when he said they use it to buy weapons. Part of the reason I'm going to be pointing this out is so you understand what the opponent thinks are important points, what they think are good points, or what they are not liking when they hear it. So when he heard them saying that they're buying weapons, you saw his eyes close for longer than just a blink, which means he's trying to block some of that information from coming in. He doesn't like it. Watch this right here.
Harris administration. What do they use that money for? They use it to buy weapons that they're now launching.
Do you see that right there, that long blink? So he feels like that's a weak point. That's not something that he wants to have to confront, or not something that he wants brought up right now.
Against our allies, and God forbid, potentially launching against the United States as well. Donald Trump recognized that for people to fear the United States, you needed peace through strength. They needed.
And as you could also see after that, he looks down, takes another note. That helps prevent you from having to show a reaction. It helps, once again, to help manage the anxiety of doing something this intense.
Recognize that for people to fear the United States, you needed peace through strength. They needed to recognize.
Now, I want you to pay attention to his brow right here, because the brow says so much. We raise our eyebrows. That's a way to bring attention to our face. We're feeling angry. We lower our eyebrows. We do other positions depending on our emotions. There's an unusual look that Walz has. Watch this right here.
Was in office. We'll sometimes hear a revisionist history, but when Donald Trump was in office, it was Donald Trump.
What's strange is the way that his brows look almost sad. There's a typical association with sadness when people's brows face this direction. So when we're feeling sad, that's oftentimes what we see. His brows do this a lot. That doesn't mean that he's necessarily feeling sad, but we oftentimes unconsciously interpret that as lacking confidence. Now, for whatever reason, that may just be how he communicates. That's why we have to establish baselines. But people are going to look at him and interpret it that way. You're going to see that throughout this debate.
Missiles did fall near U.S. troops, and they received traumatic brain injuries. Donald Trump wrote it off as headaches. Look, our allies understand that Donald Trump is fickle. He will go to whoever has.
So it's interesting. Vance really wants to disagree with this, but he also doesn't want to show it overtly. I think that that's probably part of his strategy, is stability, being calm, all those things. But watch his reaction right here.
Donald Trump wrote it off as headaches. Look, our allies understand.
See, closed his eyes, doesn't like what he's hearing, bunched his lips. And now he's starting to move around a little bit. He's trying to figure out how to respond to that, but he wants people to know that he disagrees with it.
That Donald Trump is fickle. He will go to whoever has the most flattery or where it makes sense to him.
Well, first of all, Margaret, diplomacy is not a dirty word, but I think that's something that Governor Walz just said is quite extraordinary. You yourself just said Iran is as close to a nuclear weapon today as they have ever been. And Governor Walz, you blame Donald Trump. Who has been the vice president for the last 3.5 years? And the answer is your running mate, not mine.
Once again, when Vance says something that Walz doesn't like or feels is a strong point, you're going to see that eye close again. It's the exact same thing. Watch this right here.
The vice president for the last 3.5 years, and the answer is your running mate, not mine. Donald Trump consistently made the.
So if you want to know what Walz doesn't like, if you want to know when Vance makes a point that he feels like is strong or one that he is not fond of, that's going to be his reaction. He's going to have that eye close. It's going to last just a little longer than it should.
World more secure. Now we talk about what the
and then he goes back to taking notes. So this is his reaction when Vance makes a certain type of point, closes his eyes, turns to make notes. Once again, that manages the anxiety and stress of having heard that, because it does, once again, seem like something that he is not fond of.
Sequence of events that led us to where we are right now, and you can't ignore October the 7th, which I appreciate Governor Walz bringing up. But when did Iran and Hamas and their proxies attack Israel? It was during the administration of Kamala Harris. So
now, you're probably noticing Vance talking with his hands, and that's a really important part of how we communicate. But with politicians, it's a little bit trickier, because with somebody like Donald Trump, he doesn't train for how he's going to talk with his hands in a lot of ways. There's maybe some subtle ways that he does, but generally he just has certain ways that he moves. They seem to be very tightly connected with how he feels. Whereas Vance, it's a lot more, not robotic necessarily, but it's a lot more intentional. So every movement he does with his hands, you can't interpret the same way as other people, because it's a lot more practiced. It's much more of the way that politicians just talk. So while I like interpreting the way people use their hands, he's not doing much useful in that way right now, because it's very much just sort of politician speak. There's no emotion connected to how he's moving his hands.
Broken world. Donald Trump has already done it once before. Ask yourself at home, massively increasing the asylum fraud that exists in our system, that has opened the floodgates. And what it's meant is that a lot of fentanyl is coming into our country. I had a mother who struggled with opioid addiction. So if you've been paying attention to Walz, he's really looking down this whole time. It's a different strategy than Vance has, because Vance does look at Walz 90% of the time that he's talking, whereas Walz seems to be looking down. It could be that when he's talking about this, he doesn't particularly want people to see what his reactions are, or it could also be that this is his own way, once again, of managing his own stress in this debate.
Look, we fix this issue with a bill that is necessary, but the issue on this is what happens when you don't want to solve it. You demonize it. And we saw this, and Senator Vance, and it surprises me on this, talking about and saying, I will create stories to.
See, when he's talking about things that he's really confident and passionate about, once again, the hands come out. He's locking eyes with Senator Vance. Watch this right here.
And Senator Vance, and it surprised.
So at this point, he feels like this is a really strong point for him. So when Walz feels confident, he's really able to get his body language involved into it. But when he's not, he really seems to withdraw.
Surprises me on this. Talking about and saying, I will create stories to bring attention to this. That vilified a large number of people who were here legally in the community of Springfield. The Republican governor.
Now I want you to watch Vance's reaction when he's talking about this.
Senator Vance, and it surprises me on this. Talking about and saying, I will create stories to bring attention to this.
So now we're seeing what for Vance is a fairly strong reaction to this. He's actually looking down, which is not something that he does a whole lot, but it's a way to deflect because he probably feels so strongly about what's being said right now. Let's keep watching.
That vilified a large number of people who were.
Now, this was very subtle, but if you watch the corner of Vance's mouth when he says it vilified a large number of people, you're going to see a little twitch right here. We associate this with contempt. Watch this right here.
Will create stories to bring attention to this. That vilified a large number of people.
Right there. You can see contempt. Now, contempt is only on one side of the face. That's how we know this is contempt. Very subtle and very unconscious. So that tends to be when this feeling is really strong and you don't want people to know it. It just sneaks out like this.
About and saying, I will create stories to bring attention to this. That vilified a large number of people who were here legally in the community of Springfield. The Republican governor said, it's not true. Don't do it. There's consequences for this. There's consequences. We could come together. Senator Langford did it. We could come together and solve this if we didn't let Donald Trump continue to make it an issue. And the consequences in Springfield were the governor had to send state law.
So it's very possible that Walz's look, the one I refer to as sadness, is his attempt to look non-threatening. Because sometimes people get their brow furrowed like this and it looks like anger. So it could be very intentional, or maybe this is just how he is, that he has this look, and it causes people to look non-threatening, but it also can make them look less confident. Although the rest of his body language right now is very invested in what he's talking about. So in that sense, he does appear confident.
The American dream again. I know a lot of you are struggling. I know a lot of you are worried about paying the bills. It's going to stop when Donald Trump brings back common sense to this country.
Governor, do you want to respond to that? What has Kamala Harris done?
Now, you can see Walz right there as he's preparing to respond to this. Almost looks a little bit deflated, almost exhausted by this. So, you know, as I talked about, he seems to wear his emotion a lot more in his sleeve than Vance does.
It brings back common sense to this country.
Governor, do you want to respond to that? What has Kamala Harris done?
So see the slumping of the shoulders. That shows that maybe there's a little bit of a loss of confidence as he's preparing to talk about this.
For the middle class.
Yeah, well, Kamala Harris's day one was Donald Trump's.
So now he's stood back up. But as he's preparing to talk about this, there may be aspects of this that he's not as confident about as other subjects he's talked about so far.
How is it fair that you're paying your taxes every year and Donald Trump hasn't paid any federal tax in the last 15 years, and the last year as president? That's what's wrong with the system. There's a way around it, and he's bragged about that. We're just asking for fairness in it, and that's all you want.
So it's interesting. If you watch Vance's reaction as he's talking about this, he doesn't show much, which once again suggests that as Walz is doing this, as he's talking about this, I don't think that he feels like the point that he's making is a very strong one or one that's going to have much of an effect. Because when he says things that seem to have an effect or things that he seems to think are strong, he does show something. And just watch Vance right here. He shows basically nothing.
That you're paying your taxes every year, and Donald Trump hasn't paid any federal tax in the last 15 years, and the last year as president. That's what's wrong.
So he looked up at the time, but beyond that, there doesn't seem to be much movement. He's not doing much with his mouth. He moves around a little bit, which might mean there's some energy there. But generally speaking, I think that he feels like that this is fairly flat for Walz, despite the fact that Walz is very involved and very energetic about what he's talking about.
So in Minnesota, what we did was restore Roe versus Wade. We made sure that we put women in charge of their health care. But look, this is not where, if you don't.
As they're talking about abortion, you can see that Vance's reaction is fairly strong to this. See, he doesn't typically look down a whole lot. It'll be very brief. But as he's talking about this, he looks down for a much more extended period of time, and you can see his brow looks kind of angry. Watch this right here.
Minnesota, what we did was restore Roe versus Wade.
See that look right there? So sometimes that can be a look of concentration, but to me that look is a look of irritation right here.
Made sure that we put women in charge of their health care. But look, this is not where, if you don't know Amanda or a Hadley, you soon will. Their Project 2025 is going to have a registry.
Once again, now this was interesting. Now this is a look we have not really seen much at all from Vance so far. Right now, he's lowering his chin. That protects our neck. And so when we think about this from an evolutionary standpoint, this is a very vulnerable place for us. So when we do that, sometimes we do that when we're feeling vulnerable. So when he brings up Project 2025, I don't think Vance loves that. Watch this right here.
Of their health care. But look, this is not where, if you don't know Amanda or a Hadley, you soon will. Their Project 2025 is going to have a registry of pregnancies. It's going to make it more difficult, if not impossible, to get contraception and limit access, if not eliminate access to infertility treatments. Maternal mortality skyrocket in Texas, outpacing many other countries in the world.
Now, I talked earlier about how Walz tends to close his eyes when he hears something he doesn't like. Watch Vance right here when he makes this point.
Mortality skyrocket in Texas, outpacing many other countries in the world. This is about.
So after he talks about maternal mortality going up, you're seeing Vance take that longer pause.
Healthcare. In Minnesota, we are ranked first in healthcare for a reason. We trust.
You're also seeing him blink a lot more. We do that when we're stressed. So interestingly, as we've seen so far, there have been some reactions, but this subject seems to be what he's reacting to most strongly.
Senator, thank you. Governor, you previously opposed an assault weapons ban, but only later in your political career did you change your position. Why?
Yeah, I sat in that office with those Sandy Hook parents. I've become friends with school shooters. I've seen it. Look, the NRA, I was an NRA guy for a long time.
So this is interesting. So he's saying what appears to be a practiced point. He's not showing any emotion about it. Obviously, that's sort of an odd statement that he's become friends with school shooters. I don't know if he said that wrong or if that's what he meant to say, but it is a very peculiar statement.
Only later in your political career did you change your position. Why?
Yeah, I sat in that office with those Sandy Hook parents. I've become friends with school shooters. I've seen it. Look, the NRA, I was an NRA guy for a long time. They used to teach gun safety.
So we'll go ahead and stop right here. Hopefully this has helped you better understand some of the behavior and body language we saw between both J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. Vance seems to be much more controlled. It seems like he's very practiced in the way he speaks. He seems to be able to suppress emotions pretty well. Sometimes they would leak out, but overall, his goal seems to be very stable and to show you as little as possible. Walz, on the other hand, seems to be much more animated. He wants you to know how he feels. He seems a lot more connected to expressing those emotions. It's not necessarily good, bad, or otherwise, because people are going to receive it differently, but that certainly seems to be the strategy they approached with, and it certainly seemed like Tim Walz was probably more anxious of the two, maybe a little bit more nervous or stressed over this debate. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. If you have any thoughts about it, please let me know in the comments below. Or if there's anything else or any parts of this that I missed that you want me to analyze, also let me know that in the comments below. Last thing before we get finished up is I do want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. All right, thanks for watching.